People often rush to throw away the old, discarding worn-out things and weary souls, forgetting one fundamental truth. Time is the only fire hot enough to test true gold. The rain in Blackwood County fell with a freezing, needle-like precision, the temperature hovering barely above 38 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the kind of bitter Pennsylvania autumn weather that chilled a person all the way down to the marrow. Eleanor Vance stood completely still on the cracked concrete of the driveway. She was 82 years old. She wore a faded wool coat and a simple gray scarf pulled tight against the wind. Her posture, however, was as straight as the mighty oak trees she and her late husband had once milled in this very town. She did not shiver. She did not beg. She merely looked at the grand two-story farmhouse she had called home for exactly 55 years. Every wooden plank of that house had been measured, cut, and nailed by hands she loved. Now it was just a piece of liquidated real estate. The porch light flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the wet grass. Under the shelter of that porch stood her son, Richard. He was 58, dressed in a sleek, tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the decaying mining town. Beside him stood his wife, Sylvia. She was impatiently tapping a manicured finger against the screen of her expensive phone, already mentally picking out patio furniture for their new beachfront condo in Miami. She wore a heavy designer coat, keeping well away from the edge of the roof to avoid a single drop of water touching her immaculate hair. "Here," Richard muttered coldly, refusing to meet his mother's eyes. He stepped out just far enough to avoid the rain, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the wooden deck. He thrust a crumpled piece of paper toward Eleanor. She reached out. Her hands were weathered, mapped with blue veins in the indelible calluses of a lifetime of relentless physical labor. She took the paper. It was a $50 bill. "That is the leftover cash after the settlement and the legal fees," Richard said, his voice tight, defensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. "The property transferred yesterday. The new developers are bringing the bulldozers at dawn. You cannot stay here, Mother." He was discarding her. He was throwing away the woman who had given him everything. Eleanor looked down at the wrinkled green paper resting in her palm. $50. That was the grand total, the final appraisal of over half a century of devotion, blood, and silent sacrifice. Her mind briefly, quietly drifted back through the decades. She saw the dusty, sun-lit afternoons at the old lumber mill just a few miles down the valley. She remembered the suffocating smell of fresh pine sawdust and heavy machine oil baking in the summer heat. She remembered the weeks she spent eating nothing but boiled potatoes and cheap bread just so she could buy Richard the heavy leather boots he needed for his first winter at the academy. When her husband passed away, he had left nothing but a mountain of medical debts and a failing mill. Eleanor had sold her gold wedding ring. She had sold the antique silver tea set her grandmother had brought over on a ship from Europe. She had worked 14-hour shifts sorting rough-cut lumber, her hands bleeding and blistering just to keep the bank from foreclosing on their lives. She did it all to give Richard a clean slate. She did it all to fund his new modern lumber business, the very business that had eventually made him a wealthy, arrogant man. And how had he repaid her? A few months ago, he had brought her a stack of dense, confusing legal documents. He had smiled warmly that day, bringing her favorite brand of tea. He had told her it was a simple trust fund adjustment to protect the family assets from exorbitant state taxes. Eleanor, a former librarian who always believed in the absolute sanctity of family, had trusted her only child. She had signed the papers on the kitchen table without a second thought. She had signed away the deed to her home. She had given him full, irrevocable power of attorney.
He used that power to liquidate everything she owned. He pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund his luxurious escape to the sunny coast of Florida, leaving her with a finalized eviction notice and the clothes on her back. He had legally stolen her life. "We have a flight to catch," Sylvia called out from the porch, her tone sharp and deeply annoyed. "The driver is going to be here in 10 minutes, Richard. Tell her she needs to leave the premises before we lock the gate." Richard swallowed hard, shifting his weight uneasily. "You heard her. You need to go. There's a county shelter a few miles down the highway. Walk there." Eleanor did not scream. She did not fall on her knees in the mud. She did not weep and ask where she had gone wrong in raising him. She possessed a quiet, towering dignity that made Richard look small, insignificant, and pathetic in his expensive suit. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor smoothed out the crumpled $50 bill. She pressed the creases flat between her thumb and forefinger. She folded it once. She folded it twice. She placed it carefully into the worn leather pocket of her coat. She looked Richard directly in the eyes. Her gaze was not angry. It was not hateful. It was filled with a profound, quiet pity. She saw him for what he truly was: empty. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the sound of the freezing rain. She turned around. She did not look back. She walked down the long gravel driveway, her boots crunching evenly against the wet stones. The rain continued to fall, soaking through her wool coat, but her chin remained lifted, her eyes focused straight ahead on the dark, winding road leading into town. She had no home. She had no family. She had exactly $50 to her name. With $50 in her pocket at the age of 82, the world thought her life was completely over, but they had no idea she was about to make the most important transaction of her life.
The windshield of the 1998 Ford sedan was coated in a thick layer of frost. Eleanor woke up shivering, her breath forming small white clouds in the freezing air of the cramped cabin. Her back ached terribly from sleeping upright against the worn fabric of the driver's seat. She had parked the rusty car on a secluded gravel shoulder 3 miles outside the city limits of Blackwood. She had nowhere else to go. She reached into the center console, her stiff fingers digging past old receipts and empty wrappers. She pulled out a handful of loose coins, quarters, dimes, a few pennies. She added them to the crumpled $50 bill she had kept safely in her coat pocket. $50.85. That was her entire net worth. She needed a plan. She could not sleep on the shoulder of a state highway forever. The police would eventually knock on her window and tow the car, leaving her completely exposed to the unforgiving Pennsylvania winter. She needed a piece of land. It did not have to be a house. It just needed to be a legal patch of dirt, perhaps a quarter of an acre where no one could ever evict her again. She turned the ignition. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. She drove straight to the Blackwood County Courthouse. The foreclosure auction was being held in a crowded, drafty hall on the first floor. The room was packed with local contractors, aggressive real estate flippers in cheap suits, and wealthy landlords looking to expand their portfolios. They spoke loudly, boasting about their profit margins and their latest acquisitions. Eleanor sat silently in the back row. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her gray coat still slightly damp from the rain the night before. The auctioneer, a heavy man with a booming voice and a sweating forehead, stood at the podium. He rattled off properties with dizzying speed. 3-bedroom houses went for $30,000. Commercial lots went for $50,000. Eleanor just watched. Her $50 was nothing here. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat and pulled out a faded, yellowing folder. "Next up on the docket, lot number 42,
The Starlight Theater on Elm Street, built in 1924, abandoned since 1982. A low murmur rippled through the room. Several men chuckled. "Let me be clear, folks," the auctioneer continued, shaking his head. "The roof is heavily compromised. There is extensive water damage. The city inspector has flagged it for severe structural decay, mold, and pest infestations. The county just wants it off the tax rolls. You are buying the land, but you will have to pay for the demolition yourself." He looked around the room. "Do I have a starting bid of $1,000? Silence. $500? More silence. A man in the second row laughed loudly. "I wouldn't take that garbage dump if you paid me." The auctioneer sighed. "All right, let's get this over with. Do I have a starting bid of $10? Just $10 for the deed." The room erupted in mocking laughter. They joked about the smell of rat droppings and the thousands of dollars it would cost just to haul away the rotting wood. To them, the Starlight was a curse. It was a massive, crumbling tomb of a bygone era, useless and completely devoid of value. Eleanor looked at the black and white photograph projected on the screen. She saw the grand archways. She saw the heavy brick walls. She saw a forgotten survivor of time. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand. The room went dead silent. Dozens of heads turned to stare at the back row. The men in their cheap suits sneered, whispering to each other as they looked at her faded coat and her wrinkled face. They saw an old woman throwing away money on a pile of trash. "I have a bid of $10 in the back," the auctioneer said, looking at her with genuine surprise. "Are you sure, ma'am? You understand the demolition costs." $10, Eleanor said softly. "I understand." "Any other bids?" the auctioneer asked the room. No one moved. They were too busy judging her. "Going once? Going twice?" The heavy wooden gavel slammed on the podium. "Sold for $10. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the clerk desk, ignoring the condescending stares burning into her back. She pulled the crisp $50 bill from her pocket and asked for her change. She received $40 and the official county deed to the Starlight Theater. She finally owned a piece of the earth again. The people in that hall laughed when they saw an old woman buy a giant pile of garbage, but their laughter would have died in their throats if they knew what was sleeping under that rotting roof. Eleanor parked her 1998 Ford sedan along the cracked curb of Elm Street. The Starlight Theater stood before her like a wounded giant. The grand marquee, once bright with hundreds of incandescent bulbs, was now a rusted iron skeleton hanging precariously over the sidewalk. Weeds pushed through the cracked concrete. Shards of broken glass littered the entrance, glittering like crushed ice in the pale afternoon sunlight. It was a picture of absolute desolation. She stepped out into the biting 40-degree wind. She approached the massive front doors. They were chained shut, but the wood of the secondary side door had rotted enough for her to easily slip the latch. She pushed. The heavy hinges screamed, a terrible, grinding screech of rusted iron grating against itself. The smell hit her instantly. It was a thick, suffocating stench of ammonia from decades of pigeon droppings, mixed with the heavy, damp odor of black mold and decaying fabric. Most people would have turned around and vomited. Eleanor did not flinch. She simply tied her gray scarf a little higher over her nose and stepped into the darkness. The main lobby was a cavern of shadows. The ceiling had caved in near the concession stand, allowing a single dusty shaft of light to pierce the gloom. Rainwater from a recent storm had pooled on the cracked terrazzo floor. She moved cautiously, her boots crunching over fallen plaster and shattered light fixtures. She entered the grand auditorium. It was massive, spanning nearly 10,000 square feet. Over 500 seats sat in rows, but they were nothing more than rusted metal frames covered in torn, faded red velvet. Mice and rats had long ago ripped out the horsehair stuffing to build their nests. Above her, a massive chandelier lay shattered in the center aisle, its glass droplets scattered like fallen teardrops across the sloping concrete floor. The arrogant businessmen at the auction were entirely correct about the surface. It was a disaster. But Eleanor was not a woman who looked only at the surface. She was a former librarian. She had spent a lifetime handling fragile, forgotten things. She knew how to look past a torn cover to read the story hidden inside. She did not see a cursed tomb, nor did she see a worthless pile of garbage. She saw a dormant sanctuary. She reached out with her bare, calloused hand. She touched the massive support pillars flanking the center aisles. They were solid red oak, nearly 3 feet thick and rising 30 feet into the air. She dragged her fingernails along the grain. The wood was cold, dense, and completely free of termites or rot. They had been harvested from the virgin forests of the north over a century ago. Modern builders would have paid an absolute fortune for timber of this supreme quality, yet the men at the auction had laughed and dismissed it as firewood. She knelt down, ignoring the sharp, aching pain in her 82-year-old knees. She brushed aside a pile of wet plaster to examine the foundation wall. Solid masonry. It was built with double-layered red brick, bound with a mortar mixture so strong it had not cracked despite 40 years of freezing Pennsylvania winters. The outer walls were 18 inches thick. The starlight was not crumbling. It was a fortress. It had merely shed its beautiful, decorative skin, leaving behind an unbreakable skeleton. Eleanor stood up slowly, her keen eyes tracing the intricate details of the upper balconies. She saw heavy cast bronze railings. They were heavily oxidized and green with age, weighing hundreds of pounds, but structurally perfect. She saw the original acoustic paneling hidden safely behind the moldy drywall. She realized something profound. The roof might be leaking, and the seats might be destroyed, but the heart of this building was still beating loudly. It had outlasted the Great Depression. It had survived the brutal winters. It would certainly outlast the mockery of a few arrogant real estate flippers. She spent the next 3 hours walking every inch of the massive auditorium. She measured the perimeter with steady, methodical steps. She cataloged the damage in her organized mind, separating the superficial trash from the structural anchors. She did not feel overwhelmed. She felt a deep, quiet sense of purpose welling up inside her chest. She had exactly $40 left. She had a rusty car. She had a mountain of trash to clear. It was exactly the kind of honest, brutal physical labor she needed to wash away the toxic memory of her son and his cruel betrayal. As the sun began to set, casting long, fiery orange streaks through the broken roof, Eleanor walked down the center aisle towards the main stage. The massive silver projection screen hung in heavy tatters, ripped to shreds by wind and time. Behind it lay the vast back wall of the theater. She stepped over a pile of broken bricks, intending to check the structural integrity of the rear exit doors. Her heavy boot brushed against something hard. She stopped.
With exactly $40 left to her name, Eleanor drove her 1998 Ford sedan to the local hardware store on the edge of Blackwood. She walked down the sterile aisles with a deliberate, calculated stride. She did not look at the expensive power tools or the modern machinery. She purchased a heavy 10 by 12-foot waterproof canvas tarp, a thick pair of reinforced leather work gloves, a heavy-duty push broom, and a box of 2-inch galvanized roofing nails. The cashier handed her back exactly $2.15. She was practically penniless. She was perfectly calm. She returned to the Starlight Theater as the morning temperature hovered stubbornly at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. She changed into a pair of heavy canvas overalls she had kept in her trunk for gardening. She tied her silver hair back tightly. She pulled the thick leather gloves over her gnarled, arthritis-swollen hands. She walked into the cavernous, freezing auditorium and surveyed the monumental task ahead. There were thousands of pounds of garbage, mounds of shattered glass, twisted metal frames, rotted red velvet, decayed plaster, and decades of hardened pigeon droppings blanketed the sloping concrete floor. Most people would have sat down in the filth and wept. Most people would have cursed the heavens, cursed their ungrateful children, or simply surrendered to the overwhelming despair of an 82-year-old woman facing a mountain of ruin alone. Eleanor picked up the broom. She started sweeping. She worked with a slow, mechanical, and unstoppable rhythm. She pushed heavy piles of debris down the aisles, her boots slipping occasionally on the damp terrazzo floor. She bent down over and over again, lifting jagged pieces of rusted iron grates and carrying them outside to a pile in the alleyway. Her muscles screamed, her lower back burned with a fierce, radiating pain. Dust coated her face, turning her sweat into thick streaks of gray mud. She did not stop. In Miami, her son Richard was likely sitting on a plush leather sofa, sipping an expensive iced drink, complaining about the humidity to his shallow wife. His hands were soft, manicured, and perfectly clean. He had built his false empire on the sweat of her youth, and now he was resting comfortably on the stolen equity of her old age. Eleanor swung a heavy wooden plank into the debris pile. Her hands were rough, bleeding, and honest. She preferred her hands. Every swing of her broom felt like a silent declaration of profound independence. She did not need Richard or his stolen money. She did not need Sylvia and her fake, condescending pity. The agonizing physical pain in her shoulders was a welcome distraction from the sharp, stabbing ache in her betrayed heart. She found a strange, peaceful rhythm in the monotonous labor. Push the debris, lift the heavy bucket, walk to the door, dump the trash. Repeat. She was a machine fueled entirely by stoic endurance and a quiet refusal to die in the shadows. By noon, she had cleared a narrow path down the center aisle, moving nearly 400 pounds of refuse purely by the strength of her own will. But the real danger loomed high above. A massive, gaping hole in the roof, roughly 6 feet wide, was allowing the freezing rain to destroy the plaster near the stage. She dragged a heavy 20-foot wooden ladder from a forgotten utility closet. She leaned it against the crumbling wall. She slung the heavy canvas tarp over her shoulder, gripped the rungs, and began to climb. The wood creaked dangerously under her weight. The wind howled through the broken rafters, threatening to push her backward onto the hard concrete floor below. "You're gonna break your neck up there, ma'am," a gruff, deep voice called out from the lobby shadows. Eleanor paused, holding tightly to the ladder, and looked down. A man stood in the center aisle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a faded flannel shirt dusted with fresh sawdust. This was Marcus Hayes. He was 65 years old, a retired master carpenter and a widower who lived in a small, well-kept cottage 3 blocks down Elm Street. He had been watching the old woman haul trash out of the ruined theater all morning. He had fully expected her to give up after 10 minutes. When she did not, his curiosity had turned into profound, unspoken respect. "The roof needs patching," Eleanor replied calmly, her voice steady despite the howling wind. "The water will ruin the original oak framing if it rains again tonight." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. He saw the sweat dripping from her brow and the relentless determination burning in her gray eyes. He walked forward. "Come down," he said softly, putting his heavy work boots against the base of the ladder to stabilize it.
Eleanor did not argue out of foolish pride. She nodded gracefully, descending the ladder and handing him the heavy canvas and the box of galvanized nails. Marcus climbed quickly to the rafters. Within 20 minutes, the deafening sound of hammering echoed through the cavernous theater. He secured the tarp tightly over the gap, completely sealing out the wind and the threatening gray sky. When he climbed back down, Eleanor offered him her remaining $2 for his labor. Marcus looked at the crumpled bills, then looked around the massive hall. "Put your money away, ma'am," he muttered kindly, a sad smile touching his lips. "My late wife loved this theater. We had our very first date right there in the third row back in 1978. I cannot let you rebuild it by yourself." He did not just patch the roof. Marcus returned the very next morning at sunrise, pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with his own personal tools, 2x4 wooden planks, and heavy steel braces. He began reinforcing the sagging floor joists under the balconies, cutting the wood with precise, practiced movements. Eleanor worked silently beside him, sweeping away the sawdust and hauling the discarded scraps to the alleyway. They spoke very little. They didn't need to. The shared rhythm of hard, honest physical labor was a language of its own. It was a stoic, beautiful symphony of survival. On the fourth day of their grueling routine, the heavy front doors creaked open. A young boy stood nervously in the entryway, clutching a large brown paper bag. His name was Toby. He was 19 years old, a delivery boy for the local grocery store who rode a battered bicycle 10 miles a day. He was skinny, awkward, and hopelessly obsessed with the history of cinema. He had seen the old woman and the carpenter working through the broken windows. "I brought lunch," Toby said shyly, holding out the bag. "My boss made too many roast beef sandwiches. He was going to throw them in the trash. I figured you might be hungry." It was a terrible lie. The receipt from the deli counter was still sticking out of the bag, showing he had paid $14 of his own meager wages for the food. Eleanor looked at the young man, her sharp eyes catching the slip of paper. "Thank you, Toby," she smiled warmly, her heart swelling with a sudden fierce warmth. They sat on overturned milk crates in the lobby, eating the thick sandwiches in companionable silence. The cold bit at their noses, but the hot food radiated heat through their exhausted bodies. When they finished, Toby did not leave. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed an empty wheelbarrow, and started hauling the rusted iron seat frames out to the street. A team was formed.
A discarded mother, a lonely widower, and a quiet teenager. Weeks passed in a blur of relentless, agonizing labor. They worked through freezing rain, biting winds, and the exhausting fatigue that settled deep into their bones. Eleanor scrubbed the terrazzo floors on her hands and knees until the original brass inlay of the Starlight logo gleamed weakly under the dusty light. Marcus repaired the grand staircase, replacing the rotted steps with solid pine. Toby hauled away over 4 tons of debris, filling 3 massive industrial dumpsters that he had convinced the city sanitation department to drop off for free. The stench of decay was finally gone. It was replaced by the crisp, clean scent of fresh pine sawdust, bleach, and old stone. Eleanor no longer felt the biting sting of her son tossing her away. Her soul, much like the theater, was being systematically scrubbed clean of the rot. She found a quiet, towering dignity in the deep blisters on her hands. She was rebuilding a sanctuary, and in doing so, she was rebuilding herself. She belonged here. They all did. By the end of the second month, the auditorium was entirely clear of trash. Only one massive obstacle remained: the silver projection screen. It hung heavily over the main stage, a 30-foot-wide monster of ripped canvas, stained yellow with decades of water damage and utter neglect.
It blocked the entire rear wall of the building. "We need to pull it down," Marcus stated firmly, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. "The support beam behind it looks warped. I need to check the masonry before I can safely brace the ceiling above the stage." Eleanor and Toby grabbed the heavy, dust-caked ropes on the left side of the stage, while Marcus pulled on the right. "On three," Marcus grunted heavily. "1, 2, 3. They pulled with all their combined strength. The rusted iron pulleys shrieked in protest. For a moment, the massive structure resisted. Then, with a deafening crack, the dry, rotted canvas ripped completely free from its heavy wooden frame. It collapsed downward in a tremendous, suffocating cloud of gray dust that billowed out into the empty auditorium. Eleanor coughed, waving her hands to clear the thick air. As the dust slowly settled, the vast brick wall at the rear of the stage was finally exposed to the light for the first time in 40 years. Eleanor walked forward, her boots tapping softly against the wooden floorboards of the stage. She narrowed her eyes. Something was completely wrong. She ran her calloused fingers over the cold, rough surface of the red bricks. Several weeks had passed, and the cinema had slowly reclaimed its magnificent shape through their unyielding labor. But exactly what they found hidden inside a strange, perfectly straight crack behind the torn screen was about to open an entirely new chapter.
Eleanor stared at the massive red brick wall that spanned the entire 30-foot width of the backstage area. The bricks near the center were laid entirely differently than the rest of the sturdy foundation. She noticed the mortar joints between them. They were not the thick, hardened gray cement used on the heavy exterior walls. They were thin, crumbly, and slightly discolored with a strange white chalk. "Bring me a hammer," she said quietly. Marcus walked quickly over, handing her a heavy iron mallet with a polished hickory wood handle. Eleanor gripped the smooth wood tightly, raised her tired arm, and struck the center of the wall with a sharp, forceful blow. The sound was completely wrong. Instead of the dull, heavy thud of solid masonry, a hollow, echoing resonance bounced back through the cavernous, empty auditorium. It was empty behind the bricks. Marcus frowned deeply, stepping much closer to examine the dusty masonry. He ran his thick, calloused fingers over the vertical seams, his expert eyes tracing the faint outline of a perfectly rectangular shape roughly 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It was framed flawlessly into the rigid structure. "This is not a load-bearing wall," Marcus murmured in absolute disbelief. "This is a false partition. Someone bricked up an entire doorway." "We need to open it," Eleanor stated firmly. Toby rushed to the front lobby and returned, carrying 2 heavy steel crowbars. Marcus drove the wedged tip of the first heavy crowbar deep into the crumbling mortar seam, putting his entire 200-pound frame into the long steel lever. The old red bricks groaned loudly, shifted out of place, and finally cracked open. They worked together in grueling, tense silence. They pried loose one heavy brick at a time, dropping the large blocks onto the dusty wooden floorboards of the main stage. The hole slowly grew larger, revealing thick, absolute darkness inside. Eleanor picked up a heavy-duty yellow flashlight. She clicked it on. She aimed the bright white beam straight through the ragged opening. The light swept slowly across a hidden, windowless room roughly 10 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The interior walls were not made of wood, plaster, or cheap drywall. They were lined entirely from floor to ceiling with thick, dull gray sheets of solid lead. It was a heavy, perfectly insulated, and extremely expensive fireproof vault. "What in the world is this place?" Toby whispered softly, his young eyes wide with profound awe. "A containment room,"
Eleanor said slowly, her vast knowledge as a retired librarian piecing the forgotten historical puzzle together perfectly. In the early 1920s, commercial film stock was made entirely of silver nitrate. It was highly unstable, prone to spontaneous combustion, and incredibly explosive. Theater owners had to store the reels in fireproof, lead-lined vaults to prevent the entire building from burning to the ground if a stray spark caught the dangerous celluloid. They cleared enough fallen bricks to form a safe passage. Eleanor stepped through the jagged hole first. The air inside the hidden vault was incredibly dry, biting cold, and smelled faintly of sweet camphor and old chemicals. The heavy lead walls had acted as a perfect thermal seal for decades, completely protecting the fragile interior from the brutal humidity and fluctuating temperatures of the harsh Pennsylvania seasons outside. The flashlight beam illuminated heavy steel shelving units lining the back wall. They were completely full from top to bottom. There were no stacks of forgotten paper money. There were no hidden gold bars or dusty chests of precious jewels. Instead, hundreds of circular galvanized steel canisters sat in perfectly organized, dust-free rows, silently waiting in the absolute dark for over 40 years. Eleanor approached the nearest heavy metal shelf. Her heart beat with a steady, profound, and heavy rhythm inside her chest. She reached out with her bare hands, feeling the cold, smooth metal of a large canister weighing nearly 8 pounds. She lifted it carefully. She carried it slowly back out through the jagged hole, setting it gently down on the wooden floor of the main stage under the pale ambient light of the ruined auditorium. Marcus and Toby gathered closely around her in breathless, heavy silence. Eleanor unlatched the rusted metal clasps, holding the lid shut. They snapped open with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the empty theater. She lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside the round canister, nestled neatly in its protective circular casing, lay a pristine, heavy spool of original silver nitrate film. It was perfectly preserved, showing absolutely no signs of the dreaded chemical decay that usually melted old celluloid into useless, toxic sludge. Toby leaned in much closer. "Is it a movie?" he asked curiously. Eleanor did not answer him immediately. She gently lifted the loose end of the dark film strip, holding it high towards the natural light streaming through the patched roof above. The tiny black and white frames were crystal clear and incredibly sharp. She saw wealthy women dancing in elaborate beaded dresses. She saw handsome men walking in sharp, tailored suits. She saw the unmistakable, sweeping, highly dramatic physical gestures of legendary silent film actors from the early 20th century. She gently lowered the delicate film back into the metal tin and looked closely at the faded, yellowed typewritten label pasted securely on the underside of the heavy lid. Her breath hitched sharply in her throat. For the first time in 82 years, the incredibly stoic Eleanor Vance felt completely and utterly paralyzed by a sudden shock. The title typed on the label was not a random local newsreel or a cheap, forgotten amateur cartoon. It was the exact title of a legendary full-length kinematic masterpiece produced by a major Hollywood studio in 1921. It was a famous historical holy grail, a priceless treasure that every major museum director, archivist, and film historian on Earth firmly believed had burned to ashes in the catastrophic studio fires of 1937. "It survived," she whispered hoarsely. A single, unexpected tear escaped her calm facade. She looked back into the terrifying darkness of the lead-lined vault. There were nearly 200 perfectly preserved metal canisters sitting quietly on those steel shelves, representing an unimaginable, priceless fortune of lost human history. This was not just a pile of old movies. This was an absolute miracle. Eleanor carefully wiped the feigned layer of dust from the faded yellow label of the very first reel, and as she slowly read the name of a masterpiece thought to be lost to the ashes of time forever, she realized she was holding a fortune.
Eleanor did not own a mobile phone. She walked 2 miles through the freezing 40-degree wind to the Blackwood Public Library. She paid $3 in quarters to use their secure long-distance telephone line. She dialed the direct archival office of the National Film Registry in Washington. She spoke calmly, clearly, and with absolute precision about the lead-lined vault, the silver nitrate, and the specific titles typed on the rusted metal canisters. They did not dismiss her. Less than 48 hours later, a black town car pulled to a stop on the cracked pavement of Elm Street. A tall, thin man wearing a heavy wool trench coat and thick glasses stepped out into the bitter Pennsylvania chill. His name was Dr. Julian Reed. He was the senior preservationist for the Federal Film Archive. He walked into the Starlight Theater with a look of intense skepticism. That skepticism vanished the exact second he stepped through the jagged brick hole. Dr. Reed stood inside the freezing, insulated vault. He did not speak for 10 full minutes. He opened his leather briefcase with trembling hands, pulling out a pair of pristine white cotton gloves and an illuminated magnifying loupe. He lifted the heavy, 8-pound steel canister that Eleanor had placed on the wooden work table. He opened the lid. He unspooled a 2-foot section of the silver nitrate film, holding it delicately over a portable light box. The brilliant white light pierced the transparent celluloid, revealing the flawless, high-contrast imagery of a forgotten cinematic era. Tears welled up behind his thick glasses. "My God," he whispered breathlessly, his voice breaking with profound emotion. "It is perfect. The chemical composition has not degraded a single fraction of an inch. The thick lead walls and the freezing winters created a natural, absolute stasis." He carefully placed the film back inside its protective tin. He took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with a folded silk handkerchief. "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Reed said, turning to face the quiet 82-year-old woman standing in the dusty shadows, "you have unearthed a miracle. We have actively searched for these exact studio prints for over half a century. We assumed they were reduced to ash in the California vault fires of 1937. Eleanor stood perfectly still. "What are they worth, Doctor?" she asked calmly. Dr. Reed looked at the hundreds of canisters lining the steel shelves. He did a quick, silent calculation in his head. A single lost reel of this historical magnitude routinely auctions for tens of thousands of dollars. You have over 200 pristine, master-cut features. Museums, private collectors, and historical societies will start a bidding war the second we authenticate this discovery. He took a deep, shaky breath. The absolute minimum insurance valuation for this entire collection is $8.5 million. $8.5 million. Marcus dropped his heavy hammer onto the wooden floorboards with a loud ringing clatter. Toby stepped backward until his spine hit the brick wall. They were utterly paralyzed by the astronomical, life-altering number. Eleanor did not gasp. She did not faint. She did not jump up and down or scream in ecstatic joy. She simply crossed her calloused, blistered hands over her gray wool coat and offered a small, quiet, and deeply peaceful smile. Justice had finally arrived. She had purchased the theater for $10, armed with nothing but the spare change in her pocket and the unbreakable resilience of her spirit. She had endured the mockery of arrogant men, the freezing rain, and the agonizing physical labor. She had trusted the hidden, enduring value of a discarded ruin.
The universe had rewarded her faith with an empire. Dr. Reed immediately arranged for a private security firm to guard the heavy wooden doors. He placed calls to an elite legal representatives who specialized in archival acquisitions. The Starlight Theater was no longer a crumbling tomb of bird droppings and shattered glass. It was the most important historical site in the entire state. The secret was out. News of an $8.5 million treasure could not remain hidden in a small town for very long, and it would soon reach the ears of the exact people who had callously thrown her out into the rain.
The news of an $8.5 million discovery could not be contained. It spread through the quiet, freezing streets of Blackwood like wildfire, jumped across county lines, and eventually dominated the national television broadcasts. Dozens of heavy news vans parked along the cracked curbs of Elm Street. Reporters holding heavy microphones stood in the 40-degree chill, speaking rapidly to large cameras about the miraculous unearthing of lost cinema history. A massive crowd of curious local residents, including the town mayor and several prominent business owners, gathered closely behind the yellow police barricades erected by the private security firm. They all wanted a glimpse of the millionaire. Eleanor Vance did not wear a crown, nor did she purchase a silk dress. She stood on the front wooden steps of the Starlight Theater, wearing her faded canvas overalls, her heavy work boots, and her simple gray wool scarf. Her hands were still wrapped in thick white cotton bandages to protect the deep blisters she had earned from hauling tons of rotting debris. A sleek, rented silver convertible sports car abruptly tore down the street. Its tires shrieked loudly against the damp asphalt. The car stopped, merely inches from the barricade. The heavy doors swung open. Richard Vance stepped out into the blinding, chaotic glare of the camera flashes. He wore a brand-new navy blue tailored suit, an expensive silk tie, and a thick gold watch that caught the pale afternoon light. Sylvia followed closely behind him, clutching a designer leather handbag tightly to her chest, her face perfectly made up, but her eyes darting nervously around the impoverished mining town she so deeply despised. Richard pushed his way aggressively through the crowd of reporters and local citizens. He walked right past Marcus and Toby, entirely ignoring the heavy defensive glares the two men directed at him. He stopped exactly at the bottom of the concrete steps. He looked up at the 82-year-old woman he had thrown out into the freezing rain just 2 months ago. He forced a wide, completely hollow smile onto his face. "Mother!" Richard called out loudly, deliberately making sure the reporters standing behind the barricades could hear his sudden fake affection. "Thank God we finally found you. We saw the news on television down in Miami. We have been so terribly worried about you out here in the cold." Eleanor looked down at him. She said absolutely nothing. Her silence was heavier than a mountain of solid stone. It stripped away his false charm instantly, exposing the desperate, greedy panic hiding just beneath his highly polished exterior. Richard cleared his throat nervously, his smile faltering slightly as the cameras continued to flash without mercy. "Listen, Mother, this whole thing is wonderful news for our family. The trust fund has been struggling lately, and this historical discovery is exactly what we need to get back on track. We are here to bring you home and to properly manage the sale of the theater and the films. We need to consolidate the family assets." He was demanding a share of her blood and sweat. "You have no family here," Marcus growled deeply, stepping forward to block the stairs with his broad, muscular frame. "You left her to die on the street with $50. Turn around and walk away." Richard sneered at the old carpenter, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure arrogance. "Keep your mouth shut, old man," Richard snapped violently. "This is a private family matter.
In fact, my lawyers are already drafting the necessary injunctions. She used the exact $50 from my trust fund settlement to purchase this property at the county auction. Therefore, the Starlight Theater and everything inside it legally belongs to my estate." He pointed a manicured finger directly at Eleanor. "You will sign the transfer deed today, or I will drag you through the federal court system until you have absolutely nothing left." He was threatening her. He thought she was still the quiet, obedient librarian who would blindly sacrifice herself to protect his fragile ego. He thought she was terribly weak. He was entirely wrong. The heavy oak doors of the theater opened slowly behind Eleanor. A man in a sharp, conservative gray suit stepped out onto the porch. He was carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. This was Arthur Sterling, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and prestigious intellectual property law firms on the East Coast, personally hired by the National Film Registry to fully protect their new star benefactor. Mr. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at Richard with an expression of profound, absolute disgust. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer stated calmly, his clear voice projecting perfectly over the murmuring crowd, "my name is Arthur Sterling. I legally represent Mrs. Eleanor Vance in all personal and commercial matters. I highly suggest you lower your hand and step back from my client immediately." Richard blinked rapidly, completely taken aback by the sudden appearance of high-powered legal counsel. "She used my money. The $50 was part of a legal trust distribution. I have a federal claim to this entire property." Mr. Sterling opened his heavy briefcase. He pulled out a crisp white sheet of paper bearing the official gold seal of Blackwood County. "This is the finalized, publicly recorded deed of sale from the county tax authority," Mr. Sterling declared loudly, holding the document up high for the reporters to photograph. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance purchased this property as a fully independent citizen at a public foreclosure auction. There is absolutely no legal precedent in any state in this nation that grants a child ownership of an asset simply because they previously handed their parent a $50 bill." The crowd of locals laughed loudly. Sylvia shrank back behind her husband, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "I will sue," Richard screamed desperately, his perfectly styled hair falling wildly into his face. "I have the full power of attorney. She signed the papers." "That power of attorney was strictly limited to the residential estate you fraudulently liquidated, and it was officially revoked by my office 3 entire weeks ago. You own no claim, you have no case. You own absolutely nothing here." Richard stood completely frozen. His breathing was heavy and ragged. His grand illusion of total control was crumbling rapidly into fine dust. But the universe was not finished with him yet. Mr. Sterling reached into his tailored coat pocket and pulled out a second, much smaller stack of folded papers. "Furthermore, Mr. Vance," the lawyer continued, his voice dropping into a deadly precise register, "while conducting a routine background check to ensure my client was fully protected from your frivolous threats, I came across a rather interesting public filing from the Southern District of Florida." Richard went completely pale. "It appears your Grand Luxury Development Company in Miami officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 4 days ago. You invested heavily in worthless swampland. Your primary creditors have officially seized your beachfront condo. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen, and the rental agency is currently looking for the silver sports car you drove here today." The silence that fell on Elm Street was absolute. It was a stunning, brutal execution of perfect karma. Richard had callously thrown away a lifetime of unconditional love to blindly chase an illusion of massive wealth, and his own greed had burned his entire life down to the ground. He had absolutely nothing left. He was completely broke, entirely humiliated in front of national television cameras, and utterly exposed for the pathetic fraud he truly was. Sylvia stared at him in absolute horror. "You told me the offshore accounts were fine!" she shrieked violently, hitting him incredibly hard on the shoulder with her expensive handbag. "You ruined my entire life!" She turned around violently. She pushed her way frantically through the crowd of laughing townspeople, desperately trying to hide her face from the flashing camera lenses as she ran off down the sidewalk alone. Richard stood entirely alone at the bottom of the cold concrete steps. He looked up at his mother one final time. His eyes were wide, pleading, silently begging for the soft, forgiving woman who had always bailed him out of his terrible mistakes. Eleanor looked down at the pathetic, broken man. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply offered him the exact same cold, absolute silence he had given her on the porch of her old home. She turned her back on him. When the car of the treacherous son faded into humiliation, Eleanor turned around and walked back into the movie theater, knowing that the final act of this story had only just begun.
The transformation of the Starlight Theater was not merely a renovation, it was a resurrection. With a small fraction of the $8.5 million, Eleanor did not build a mansion or buy a fleet of cars. Instead, she poured the resources back into the very foundation that had saved her soul. She hired a team of the finest restoration craftsmen in the country, but she kept Marcus Hayes as the chief foreman. She kept Toby as the head of historical archives. The Grand Marquis no longer hung like a rusted skeleton. It was restored to its 1924 glory, shimmering with 300 warm, incandescent bulbs that chased away the shadows of Elm Street. The interior was stripped of its mold and decay, replaced by polished mahogany, heavy gold leaf trim, and lush, deep crimson velvet seats that smelled of cedar and history. The opening night was a spectacle the people of Blackwood County would discuss for generations. The temperature was a crisp 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air inside the theater was warm and filled with the scent of fresh buttered popcorn and expensive perfume. Every seat was filled. The town mayor, the local miners, the school teachers, and the preservationists from Washington sat side by side. Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the lobby. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress and the same gray scarf she had kept since the day she was evicted. She did not work like a millionaire. She looked like a woman who had finally come home. She greeted every guest with a steady hand and a calm, genuine smile. When the house lights dimmed, the auditorium fell into a profound, expectant silence. The heavy crimson curtains parted slowly. The original 1921 film masterpiece, the very first Rio Eleanor had touched in the dark, began to flicker across the brand new silver screen. The black and white images were crisp, hauntingly beautiful, and full of a life that had been buried for over 40 years. The audience gasped. They cheered. Some of the older residents wept quietly, remembering their own youth as they watched the flickering shadows of a lost world. Eleanor did not sit in the VIP box. She stood at the very back of the auditorium, leaning against the solid oak pillars she had once scrubbed with her own bleeding hands. She watched the light from the projector dance across the faces of the people she loved. As the film reached its final triumphant frame, the audience rose in a thunderous 5-minute standing ovation. Eleanor stepped out of the side exit into the cool night air. She walked toward the rear of the property, where a small, beautiful park had been cleared. She sat on a stone bench, looking out over the quiet valley. The moon hung high over the Pennsylvania hills, casting a silver glow over the newly painted brickwork of the Starlight. She felt a deep, radiating peace. She had lost a house, but she had gained a sanctuary. She had lost a son, but she had found a community that valued her worth. She had been treated like a piece of discarded trash, only to discover that she was the most precious treasure of all. The world always moves in its own mysterious circular ways, taking away a tattered hut, only to return an entire sky full of stars.